Was a game that defined an era, Street Fighter II would be pretty high on the list of candidates. The original Street Fighter laid a foundation, but what was put upon it was more than just a sequel, it was more like an empire. In the days before DLC and special editions and that sort of thing, the only real way to upgrade or change up a game would just be to release another one. And that's exactly what happened here. It's gotten to the point with the Street Fighter series, even in this day and age of downloadable content, where a new game will be released and it has not much more than just upgrades to the previous. That might sound like I'm about to take a huge dump on the series, but that's far from the truth. Street Fighter II, Mortal Kombat, huge parts of my youth. These were games that I really couldn't get enough of in my teenage years. A used Sega Genesis was the first 16-bit system that I ever purchased with my own money, back in the fall of 1993, and just a few short months later my parents got me my Super Nintendo for Christmas. I was able to play a lot of these games when they were contemporary, and even when Street Fighter II was retailing for nearly $80 in stores, I managed to find a used copy for significantly cheaper. If you're just buying retro video games to play them and not to collect, it's kind of useless to own all the different versions of Street Fighter II. Your best bet is to just pick up your choice of the Super Nintendo or Genesis version of Super Street Fighter II, the new challengers. Personally, I've always preferred the Genesis version. While the Super Nintendo one might look and sound a little prettier, the Genesis one just plays and feels a little bit better to me. That just might be because around the time of its predecessor, the Special Champion Edition, and its release, Sega came up with the 6-button arcade pad, which is probably one of my favorite video game controllers of all time. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Let's take a look at some of the different home ports of Street Fighter II. Street Fighter II The World Warrior was released in the arcades in 1991. A Super Nintendo version followed a little over a year later. It featured 8 playable characters and 4 boss characters. You choose a character and traveled around the world to fight the other characters and then the bosses. If you beat them all, you win. An updated version of this game called a Champion Edition was released in 1992. It introduced the ability to play as those 4 boss characters, as well as being able to have both players choose the same character in head-to-head combat. There were a few other tweaks and adjustments made. The only original home release that was ever seen was actually for the PC Engine in Japan. You see this over here? This is a little bit of emulated footage. I'd blow it up and put it full screen, but then you'd see just how bad the animation is on this emulated footage. On the other hand, the Genesis saw a release called the Special Champion Edition, which added some extra features which were inspired by the next upgrade. Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting came to arcades in late 1992. It added a turbo or hyper mode, which adjusted the gameplay speed and added a few new attacks to help balance out the characters. Several months after its release in arcades, a version came out for the Super Nintendo. Super Street Fighter II The New Challengers first appeared in the arcades in 1993, and home ports to both the Super Nintendo and Genesis followed less than a year later. This version took everything from its predecessors and added 4 new playable characters. So this video isn't too long. I'm refraining from describing all the characters and their styles, but at this point in time, I find it very unlikely that you haven't played a version of Street Fighter II or another game which was a derivative. There have certainly been enough of them. At the time of its release, the Genesis version of Super Street Fighter II had the largest memory capacity of any Genesis game. It also included what they called a Super Battle Mode. This took the arcade version and then made it so you could play against all 16 characters in the game. Aside from the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions, there were versions released for various home computer platforms, some of which I am not too familiar with. However, I did play the PC version, which was based pretty much on the Super Nintendo version. Back then, gamepads for PCs really didn't work all that great, and as much as I loved the Gravis Pad back in the day, the experience was still much better on the Super Nintendo or Genesis. A turbo version of Super Street Fighter II was also released in the arcades. It added the Hyper Mode and also a new boss named Akuma to the lineup. The only home version of that really was on the 3DO. Most, if not all, of these games have become available on various downloadable services for various consoles and formats, and it's not too hard to find any of them. There are also 2 handheld versions of Street Fighter 2, which I feel are interesting, worth noting, so let's take a look at those as well. First is the 1994 release of Street Fighter 2 on the Game Boy. A very stripped down version featuring 9 characters total. It was a noble attempt at making a Game Boy version. It fares a whole hell of a lot better than the Game Boy versions of Mortal Kombat. It's far from perfect, but you can do a lot worse when it comes to Game Boy fighters. Several years later, the Game Boy Advance brought us a game, which was a much more respectable portable version. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo Revival on GBA is a version of the arcade Super Turbo with new art and some background stages lifted from Street Fighter Alpha series. It also has some pretty cool variety of game modes as well. As for the gameplay goes, there's a lot of little intricacies about it. I'd go into more detail, but the video would go a lot longer, so let me just throw it right to you. Who are your favorite characters in Street Fighter 2 to play as? What are your favorite versions of Street Fighter 2? Leave a comment down below. Personally, as evident by this video, my favorite character plays as Ken, and of course, Super Street Fighter 2 on the Genesis is my favorite version to play as, although I do think that Super Turbo Revival on the GBA is pretty awesome for a handheld. Even before I started scripting this video, that this was going to be my longest one in quite some time. I hope you've enjoyed it. Maybe some other time I could do more overviews and stuff quite like this. Don't know how often, but if you like what you see, let me know. Thank you for watching, especially to those of you who've stuck around to the end. Until next time, take care.